This is Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield, a podcast that resources families and friends with tools to have important conversations about mental and emotional health. This show is sponsored by Mayfield Counseling Centers, helping you find clarity, hope, and purpose. Here's your host, Trever Shirin.
Thank you for joining us on Candid Conversations. I am Trever Shirin, joined as always by Dr. Mayfield.
Yay!
And today we are continuing our conversation about Erickson's stages of development. If you have not heard the first episode in this series,
turn it off and go back to the first episode. Yeah.
Because it'll make way more sense if you get the foundational aspects first. And
we're not going to review.
Nope. So let's dive in. So last week we ended on industry and inferiority. I'm feeling a little inferior today. Ages 6 to 12. And so now we're beginning our conversation with identity versus role confusion, which is ages 12 to 18.
Is it 12 to 18? Let's talk about that for a second.
Let's talk about the difference between a 12-year-old and an 18-year-old.
Well, let's talk about the difference between a 12-year-old and somebody that thinks they're 18 and an adult that should probably still be stuck in this.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because we talked about last week that Erickson developed these about 50, 60 years ago. And, think about the 18-year-old 50 or 60 years ago. I'm joining the Army, I'm Air Force, I'm going off and starting my job, I'm trade, I'm going to work in a factory, I'm going to go to college, whatever that might be. And they were ready. They were prepared. Like life was, here we go. You don't have a choice. I want you to reflect real quick on what you think about adolescence nowadays.
Yeah.
And, most 18-year-olds, I'm like...
I make the joke pretty consistently that when I was in high school, common understanding was that the frontal lobe, the last part of your brain to developed fully at approximately 21 years of age. Mm-hmm. And so I had in my mind, like at 18, like, okay, when I turn 21, I'll have a fully developed brain. And then I turned 20 and science comes out and they're like, oh, actually, that frontal lobe doesn't develop until 25.
For men.
So then I turned 23 and guess what happens? Oh, yeah, maybe 27. So now I turn 26 and they're saying closer to 30. And so I've just come to accept the fact that I will never have a fully developed brain.
Well, I think the reason we talk about this, and it's interesting, is it's societal.
Yeah.
You think about like tasks of development, when you think about when my grandfather was 12 years old, what was he doing at home? Like he had a paper route. He was out doing his job or whatever. So by the time he was 18, it was like, yeah, I'm good. See you, mom, dad.
I'm pretty sure my great-grandfather was enlisted in the Army for World War II at 18.
Right. And my grandfather, so was my grandfather, right? He was in the Navy. But you look at, again, nothing wrong with this. This is just where we're at, and we're conversing about this. But, people get to 18 and are like, oh, I want to do a gap year. I want to go travel, which is very much a socioeconomic, comment there. But I'm going to go, I don't know what I'm going to do. Like, I don't know if I had an option. Like, you're going to college.
Right.
But, we think about this, and again, it's a commentary. It's not a condemnation.
Right.
But, I think if Erickson were here, he probably would add an extra stage.
Middle
adulthood between, ages 18 and 30. 30, right?
That's what I've heard conventionally.
Yeah. So the identity versus role confusion is basically, and this is something that's interesting, is that I don't know how very many adults that can answer this question. Who am I? Right? And that's what Erickson said was we're wrestling through this question of who am I? Where do I matter? How do I matter?
And it might be more reasonable to ask the question, say that in this stage we are starting to ask that question, and that in order to come through this stage of development successfully, quote unquote, we have to have an answer that we can at least jump from.
Yeah, an answer that we're confident from, right? And so it's, if you're in a religious family, this is when your kid starts going, okay, do I believe what my parents have told me to believe? Do I Do I have the same political viewpoints? Do I see the world in the same way? How do I feel about social justice? How do I feel about the poor? How do I feel about grades? How do I feel about sports? How do I feel about
romance?
Yeah. And so all those kinds of things. And we also find, and this is the stage that a lot of times sexual identity is questioned. And I know that can freak a lot of people out. It's just it's a part of the normal developmental stage of going, okay, am I attracted to?
Yeah.
Why? How?
Well, and if you ever look into high school, my wife teaches high school, and we did an episode with her. I encourage you to go back and listen to it. Every high school has cliques. They have groups. They have clubs. They have groups of individuals who share something in common.
Right.
And I think that is really part of this stage, is finding your group, finding your people. And this is a process that we go through for our entire lives, because for me, my group of people in high school are not the people I hang out with now.
I hope not.
Those three people, so specifically the three that I hung out with the most in high school, they still hang out with each other. But even at that time, like they were my group for a time, and now I've found different groups and
healthier, different perspectives.
I've grown, I've changed. They've all grown and changed in different ways than I have, and so it's important to realize that this is a continuing journey. It's not just a one and done. But in high school, we're trying to find our people. We're trying to find our clubs. We've got the Pathfinder Club, the D&D Club, the football club, the
Chess.
show choir club, but like all of these things. And once we find our people, we can start to answer this question a little bit better. But then there are times when teenagers don't know where they belong and they feel like they're the outsider.
And I'll say this too, is a lot of times parents think that they have to abdicate their role as parents in this time. And actually, no, it's there needs to be more intentionality as parents during this time. It's going to look different. It might be a little bit harder to navigate. There's a lot of emotion going around. There's a lot of questioning, maybe anger, whatever it might be. But research shows that over 50% of teenagers still want their parents' opinions and voices in this. And this is where we start, we talk about have conversations about all the topics that we don't typically want to talk about, like drugs and sex and
drunk driving, texting and driving,
social media, pornography, all these kinds of things.
What clothes are you wearing?
Right.
How are you wearing your makeup? Those things.
And I think that doing it in a way that creates space for conversation, realizing that your kids are their own individuals, they're becoming adults. How do you exercise your opinion without my way or the highway? I mean, there's a lot of different things in there that really...
And one thing I want to touch on is that, yes, that we're talking about the stages of development for an individual, but let's focus for just an instant on the parents, because each stage poses different challenges for the parent.
Well, I always tell
parents...
And
in this stage...
Yeah. Well, I always tell parents real quick, I always tell parents that the hard work is done between 0 and 12. 0 and 10, 0 and 12. If you can stay consistent between 0 and 12, your teenage years should be actually fun, raising your kids, right? And not easy.
Right.
Right? But it shouldn't be, oh my gosh, I've got teenagers. Like, no, I hate when parents do that. I'm like, no, enjoy this. Like, lean in, explore, grow. And so I think for parents, we look at these stages and go, okay, I made it to the next stage. Like, no, enjoy the journey.
Yeah. Yeah. And recognize the challenges that are unique to each stage of development and each time of life, because it's unique and it's different. And it's also unique and different for each individual who is growing.
Well, and we find that if there's teenagers, so, the 12 to 18, but also 18 to 27 or 28, if there is a difficulty in this stage, you've all met that perpetual teenager. Right. 35 years old, living in mom's basement, playing video games. Nothing wrong with video games. Nothing wrong with living in mom's basement. But if that's all you've aspired to, and you're still kind of stuck in that adolescent mindset, that's the identity versus role confusion stage probably didn't get developed the way it needed to be,
or you weren't pushed to find that group. And I think that in a lot of ways there is a group of people that are the video gamers and the gamers, and I relate heavily to that. I have a whole podcast dedicated to the nerd culture, but I think recognizing that there is an importance to identifying who you are.
Well, a balanced life too.
Right.
Right. I mean, I was watching a documentary last night on the video game culture in Japan, and they actually have gaming centers that have a food court and bunk beds and a place to sleep, and they sit there and play for 24 hours at a time. That's probably not the best balance. Yeah. You're talking about, we're having Ogred's Casino, and we're having game night, and we're doing D&D, and we're creating story and community around that kind of stuff. That's so different than 24 hours a day playing Fortnite.
Yeah. And as we've talked about a lot with mental health, it's about balance. So let's move on to the next stage.
The next three are kind of existential, so just go with us on this one.
So the next stage would technically be a middle adolescence, middle adulthood. This is the one part of Erickson's stages of development that has kind of grown in the past couple decades, where we've started to see this increase in the length of time it takes for a child to turn into an adult. And that comes with all sorts of convoluted identifiers and definitions and all of that. So just be mindful of there is the possibility of a period of time where there's a stage of development where it's just initiating the growth process into the next stage. Absolutely. And working through some of the old ones.
Yep.
So the next one, typically 20s through 40s. And so we're entering our largest age range of Erickson stages. And this is intimacy versus isolation.
And I think it speaks for itself.
These are the most easily understood.
Right, to some degree. I mean, intimacy is the ability to make meaningful, deep, lasting relationships. Mm-hmm. And that's, studies actually continually show that if you are in a safe, trusting, lasting, committed relationship, you have improved cardiovascular, you have improved brain health, you have longevity of life, you have a lot of these things that are really improving the life. So I think the big thing is realizing, okay, how do I make relationships? How do I develop relationships? And this is where we're finding that the average age of marriage is going to late 20s, early 30s now. And again, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, we're not placing blame or condemnation or judgment on it. We're just acknowledging that this seems to be the trend.
And that, but the cool thing with that, though, is that divorce rate's going down.
Right. And I think some of that is the current generations, and I'm still figuring out how I feel about generational studies, but the current generations are seeing so much divorce in their childhood that they are hesitant to initiate marriage because they don't want to experience the same thing or put their kids through the same experience. And so there's a wariness that comes with that I think can be unhealthy, but also can be very honoring of the institution of marriage.
Absolutely. When you look back, look at I know you have a longevity of long marriages in your family, and so do we. My great-grandparents were married for 68 years. Yeah. Both my grandparents were married for over 50 years. My parents are just celebrated their 40th, right? So, I mean, there's that longevity in that. But I also don't think there's anything wrong with getting, my sister-in-law got married 2 years ago at 31, and my brother-in-law is 37.
Yeah.
I think they're going to have a great, it's a different tasks and different things, but it's going to be,
Well, and I think that it's important to realize that intimacy doesn't necessarily mean marriage either. And that as we're developing the sense of identity, role confusion, and intimacy isolation, there are times when you go through your 20s and you're learning how to learn, you're learning what you want, learning what the point of everything is supposed to be, or at least laying the groundwork for it. And you can come to a place where you become a very strong, independent person who doesn't need anybody, but you do that through developing intimacy with other people and being willing to be vulnerable with people that are close to you, having a close group of friends. My sister, one of my three sisters, who is in her 20s and not dating anyone at the moment, I've gotten to see her really develop in a way of becoming independent and not just longing for an intimate partner, but developing relationships with friends and relationships with her family that right now, and trying to figure out who she is and what her purpose is and how she wants to go through the rest of her life. And it's been a really cool experience to see her go through that process in this stage of development, from it's all about being married and all about having a boyfriend and all about like, that's the point. I want to do that, to it's okay. Like, I'm okay with who I am. And it's a process that I can still see that she's in, but it's so admirable when I see somebody who is able to be themselves. Because I think sometimes we jump into the intimacy and that narrow definition of marriage too quickly.
Well, we'll go back and listen to our two separate episodes on singleness over the last first season. I think we did one this season too.
Second season, yeah.
Yeah, because we had to handle that well and do that well. So this next stage is generativity versus stagnation, and this is something that I think I've shared on here before. Integrity versus despair, but is the last one. But generativity versus stagnation. Generativity basically involves finding your life's work, contributing to the development of others, and activities such as volunteering, mentoring. Is your career meaningful, and those kinds of things. And I think I've shared on here that I can sit with pretty much anything that comes into this office. I've heard some of the most horrific stories, sat with the most, devastating things. But the hardest thing sometimes for me to do is when somebody comes in and goes, I'm in my late 50s. What has my life meant? I'm like, oh my gosh. I mean, obviously it's not too late to start.
Right.
But to wrestle with some despair, some stagnation that goes, I've wasted 50 years of my life.
When I challenge our listeners to see this stage of development through the lens of the midlife crisis, because that's
which
really
is somewhat of a myth.
Yeah, totally. And I think that if we look at it, the things that we notice and we say like, oh, this is the midlife crisis, may actually just be this stage of development. And there's a pressure to have gone through that by 40, but it's a range. And some individuals, this might be a pretty smooth transition, because and I think that's important to recognize. I think specifically in these latter stages of development that they can be pretty smooth.
Well, yeah, think about I'm going to be 38 in 3 months. So I'm getting to 40. But I'm like, for the last 5 years, I have had a wonderful career, but it's not felt like a career. It's felt like just kind of who I'm supposed to be and what I'm supposed to be doing. Yeah. And that's what we're talking about.
Right.
It's, but even people that go in and punch the clock can still find purpose and value in that, right? It's just how you look at it. But, approaching 40, I'm like, okay,
and recognizing that it doesn't just have to be your career. I think, one thing we seem to keep coming back to is we have a very narrow definition of what things mean. But I know several individuals who their career, their vocation, their occupation is not meaningful to them. They don't get satisfaction or whatever from it. It's what they're doing.
And they make a good living or whatever that might be.
And it's what they're doing outside of those hours that is really meaningful to them. They are bringing up strong children. They are mentoring young individuals. They are creating things artistically that have meaning and carry weight.
Well, but I think it's a kind of, in some ways it's a catch-22 as well, because I'm thinking of my father-in-law, who has had a fantastic career in a field that he, for the most part, has really enjoyed. But he's turning 60 this year, and he could retire. But he's kind of come to this going, okay, what is my purpose outside of my job?
Yeah.
Now, all of us that know him and love him go, you're a fantastic mentor, you disciple young marrieds, you are a fantastic woodworker, you care for your grandkids and your kids well. There's a lot of those things that we could point to, but when you're in the midst of it, and that's been something that you've in your life for so long. We're getting into the integrity versus despair piece, but I think it's that sometimes you need people in your life speaking those truths over you,
Right.
going, you're not just your career.
Right.
You're so much more than that, and here's how, and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
But
which may have some correlation to our autonomy versus shame, doubt, initiative, and guilt. It all continues to be, it's not a step-by-step process. It is a continuous process. The final stage of development, according to Erickson, is integrity versus despair. And this begins from the mid-60s to the end of life.
Again, it could be as early as 55. I think it's retirement age is what I would look at.
Mm-hmm. And this is the moment when you're looking back on your life and you're asking yourself, did I do this well?
Did what I do matter?
Was it worthwhile?
Mm-hmm. And I think people that feel proud of their accomplishments have that integrity.
Yeah.
I look back and go, okay, I have very few regrets. And I'd like, most of us to look back on our life and go, I have very few regrets,
And to look and say, like, yeah, I've left a legacy, and that legacy is something that is meaningful to me and also gives value to the people who experience it.
Mm-hmm. But the people that are struggling are the ones that look back and go, I should have, I wish I would have, I could have.
Yeah. Shooting on themselves.
Right.
Their selves. Shooting on themselves.
Yes. And that's where I think I get a lot of, it really is hard for me as a counselor to sit with people that are like, what do I have to show for my life? And that's
especially if you look at it and it's hard to pick out those things.
As a counselor too.
A counselor too. And I mention that to say, like, there are some times when this is very legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
And the beauty of life is that you can go through your entire existence up until 65, whatever, and look back on it and feel like there's nothing that you've given to the world and no meaning that you've added. And yet, as long as you still have breath, you have the opportunity to change that and to grow and develop and to add value and to give meaning. I
worked with a client many, many years ago that was in this stage. Never married, never had kids, all about career. And really back in life going, I made a lot of money, but who cares? Mm-hmm. And and so I said, what are you going to do today? And they were like, well, I always thought about fostering. And I'm like, okay, so what does that look like? Well, they ended up becoming a foster parent. Yeah. And that for 65, I think, I don't know, it was 10 years ago. I'm not sure if they're still around, but for 10 years, they were creating meaning and purpose in other people's lives and meaning in their own life. And I think that's fantastic.
It's really beautiful.
Never too old.
Right. And I think that oftentimes we come to this place in life where we look back so much that we don't realize that there's anything ahead, and that the ahead doesn't have to be controlled by the behind. Right. And recognizing that I have a choice to make right now that is different than the choices I've made in the past. Mm-hmm. And that is true of every single one of these stages that we've talked about, that you have the opportunity to work through trust, mistrust, autonomy, shame, doubt, all industry and fear, all of it. You have an opportunity to grow, to press in, to push. And sometimes, this is our shameless plug, sometimes you just need somebody else to sit with you and to help you through that process.
Mm-hmm. Not a shameless plug, but that was good.
Thanks.
Well, and I want you all to be aware of too that if you're in Colorado along the Front Range, even in the surrounding states, coming up on November 2nd, we have the Springs Mental Health Summit, which is a place for us to equip you to be that person that can sit with others, maybe even work through your own stuff. But it's a low investment. If you use the code Mayfield at springssummit.org, get 25% off. But it's a great community building time and a time for all of us to grow in our care of ourselves and our community.
We will catch up with you next week.
Thank you for joining Candid Conversations. If you would like more information, you can email candid@mayfieldcounseling.com or call 719-452-4803.